In the centuries before the Viking Age began, Scandinavia lay at the furthest extremity of the known world. It had received little contact from the civilizations and empires that shaped ancient Europe, namely that of the Greeks and Romans. However, despite its geographic isolation, it was by no means culturally stagnant. The region was home to numerous Germanic tribes scattered across the vast landscape in countless coastal communities and inland farms. The natural features of Scandinavia, with its dense forests and limited road networks stretching from the deep fjords of Norway to the low-lying archipelagos of Denmark and the extensive rivers and lakes of Sweden, made overland travel difficult, forcing such societies to be naturally oriented towards the water instead. In turn, this provided a reliable and accessible transport route that allowed for communication, movement, and exchange of peoples, goods, and ideas along Scandinavia's coastline. As the early medieval period began around the turn of the 6th century, Scandinavian society had begun to organize itself into kinship-based communities headed by local chieftains who derived their power and authority from landholdings, a loyal group of followers, as well as success in warfare and trade. Political power was fragmented and widely decentralized amongst the region's local elites, who competed fiercely over what little agricultural land and resources were available. As a result, many Scandinavians began to look beyond their immediate confines and establish long-distance trade networks to other parts of the European continent to acquire whatever resources they needed. Together, this combination of political fragmentation, scarcity of resources, and an outward-looking trade base created the conditions necessary to bring about the start of the Viking Age. Central to this development was the evolution of Scandinavian shipbuilding and seafaring expertise. By the 8th century, Norse shipwrights had perfected clinker-built vessels that were both light yet strong and capable of being either rowed or sailed across open water, up flowing rivers, or even hauled over land. The most important and iconic of these vessels to emerge was that of the longship. Narrowly built with a shallow draft, it was designed for speed and maneuverability. The largest of these ships were up to 30 meters in length, with a crew of close to 100 men, and were sometimes ornamentally decorated with dragon heads and tails at the fore and aft. These longships were not solely used to carry trade, but were also used as instruments of war. Consequently, maritime trading and raiding developed not as separate activities, but as part of the same seaborne culture. By the 7th century, Scandinavian mariners had established a presence in the markets and towns along the Baltic and North Sea coasts, exchanging goods and absorbing knowledge of distant lands, all the while learning where wealth was concentrated, which routes or areas were poorly defended, and how local political instability could be exploited to their advantage. Seasonal raiding, therefore, grew coincidentally out of this commercial environment, as it offered a faster and more opportunistic means of acquiring wealth and prestige. The profits of trading and raiding were then redistributed by the elites to their followers, reinforcing their loyalty and increasing the social standing of ambitious leaders, who could then amass larger retinues and more powerful fleets, becoming expeditions. It was against this backdrop that the first widely recorded Viking raids occurred at the end of the 8th century. Off the northeast coast of England lay the island monastery of Lindisfarne, which in the year 793 fell victim to a raid by the Norsemen, who killed many of the monks and carried off a great deal of treasure in the process. This blatant targeting of an undefended site of worship sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world, many of whom viewed it as a desecrating assault by barbaric pagans. But to the Vikings, the targeting of an isolated, treasure-laden monastery proved to be easy pickings, and thus set the precedent for similar raids to follow in subsequent years. Throughout the 790s and into the first decade of the 9th century, Viking raiders struck other island monasteries and coastal communities around the Irish and North Seas. These early attacks were at first purely seasonal, with the longships setting sail in the summer to raid and plunder before returning home for the winter. These coastal raids were so successful and lucrative that the Vikings soon moved on to targeting even larger and wealthier sites further inland by sailing up Europe's great rivers. In the year 845, 120 longships sailed up the Seine, sacked the city of Paris, and only left out of being paid a large ransom. Similar cycles of raiding and demanding payment to leave were experienced elsewhere along the rivers of the Loire, Rhine, and Thames during the mid-9th century. But in the year 850, the Norsemen began to evolve their tactics further. That year, the Vikings overwintered in England for the first time, creating a more sustained presence that could exert greater damage over a wider area than waterborne raiding could achieve alone. Ireland had already seen such bases develop a few years earlier, after the Vikings sailed up the River Liffey and established the fortified ship enclosure known as a Longfort on the shoreline, thereby laying the foundation of what would become the city of Dublin in the year 841. The Viking presence in the Irish Sea region would intensify significantly in the following decades, with other towns such as Waterford, Limerick, Wexford, and Cork also being founded. But the Norsemen did not simply confine themselves to these coastal enclaves, for they also assimilated into local Irish society and politics. Alliances were formed between Irish kings and Viking warlords, which over time led to marriages and families forming between the two groups. They adopted elements of each other's language and customs, which gave rise to the Norse Gaels, who dominated the maritime zones around Ireland as well as into Scotland. Here too, a similar pattern of Norse raiding, settlement, and colonization had already occurred across Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man, resulting in outposts of Viking power and influence across the Atlantic fringes of Europe that were connected to their Scandinavian homelands. But it was not only in the cold seas of northern Europe that the Vikings were forging a presence during this time, for they also began to venture further south. Viking raids were recorded along the coasts of Iberia, North Africa, and even into the Mediterranean during the mid-9th century, with cities such as Lisbon, Seville, and even Pisa experiencing attacks. These sporadic raids continued on and off across much of coastal Europe for years. But in 865, another profound change in Viking ambitions materialized. On the southeast coast of England, a large Norse fleet landed in the autumn of that year, but they did not come to raid and plunder. They came to conquer and settle the land for themselves. The Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle referred to the immense Viking host, was supposedly led by the sons of the semi-legendary Viking warlord Ragnar Lodbrok, who sought to avenge their father's death after he was thrown into a pit of venomous snakes on the orders of King Ella of Northumbria. Whatever the truth of the legend, a large Viking army soon began marauding across eastern England, with York falling in 866 to become the center of a powerful Scandinavian realm known as Jorvik. A few years later, the Vikings returned south to subdue East Anglia, followed by parts of Mercia. The only Anglo-Saxon kingdom to remain standing was that of Wessex, whose king, Alfred the Great, mounted a campaign to drive off the Viking incursions and secure the survival of Anglo-Saxon England. Eventually, by 887, the Great Heathen Army was defeated at the Battle of Edington, and in the resulting peace settlement, the Vikings were permitted to retain control over much of the land they had conquered in eastern and northern England, which came to be known as the Danelaw. What followed was a profound demographic and cultural transformation as more Scandinavian settlers arrived in the region to build farms and communities of their own. Many words from Old Norse entered the English language as a result of this influx of people, many of which are still with us to this day. Words like give, take, sky, skull, egg, and window all stem from Old Norse, as do many of the region's place names. The martial prowess of the Vikings earned them a reputation of being both feared and respected on the battlefield. While these struggles were playing out in the west, the Vikings were also expanding eastwards across the Baltic. Swedish Vikings, often called Varangians, developed trade routes through the river systems of Eastern Europe that linked the Baltic to the Black and Caspian Seas. Furs, wax, honey, and amber from Scandinavia traveled southward in exchange for silver, fine cloth, and luxury goods from as far away as the Mediterranean and even Baghdad, just as their counterparts had done so in the British Isles and parts of Western Europe. The Vikings who sailed eastwards to what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine assimilated with the local population and embedded themselves within the political structures of the region to form mixed Norse Slavic communities.
In the year 862, a Viking leader named Rurik established rule over Novgorod, and later one of his followers named Oleg seized control of Kiev in 882, thereby laying the foundations of the Kievan Rus, which would be a formidable power base across much of Eastern Europe over the next 4 centuries. The Vikings who traversed these eastern trade routes also came into contact with what was then the largest and wealthiest city on earth, Constantinople. The bustling capital of the Byzantine Empire offered the Norse traders almost every type of commodity, trinket, or treasure imaginable. It proved so alluring that Scandinavian and Rus fleets attacked the city on several occasions, attempting to take its bountiful riches for themselves. Though more peaceful relations were established in subsequent years, it was out of this contact that the famed Varangian Guard emerged, the elite imperial bodyguards of the Byzantine emperors in the year 988. Renowned for their loyalty and ferocity in battle, the Guard drew its recruits exclusively from amongst the Rus and the Viking homelands, giving it an overwhelmingly Norse composition in an otherwise predominantly Greek world. As a result of this outward migration by the Norse peoples, Scandinavia began to undergo a process of change for itself, as the Vikings brought back elements of cultural exchange from lands they had visited. Up until this point, much of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had remained the contested patchwork of fragmented chiefdoms and petty kingdoms. They were nevertheless united in some cultural aspects, sharing a set of mutually intelligible dialects that together formed the Old Norse language, as well as worshipping a pantheon of gods that made up the Old Norse pagan religion. Deities such as Odin, the god of wisdom, poetry, and war, and Thor, the god of thunder, strength, and protection, were part of a wider natural world comprising various other gods and goddesses, as well as a plethora of mythological creatures, including elves, dwarves, and trolls. Although some of these beliefs, myths, and legends were later preserved in the writings of the Norse sagas, the decentralized and fragmented nature of the Viking world began to undergo a process of political, social, and religious consolidation as the 10th century advanced, with Christianity making inroads into Scandinavia and sovereign kingdoms forming in its wake. Denmark was the first to undergo this transition. Royal power had already begun to coalesce around the end of the 9th century, but it was only with the emergence of Harold Bluetooth in the mid-10th century that this process accelerated and Christianity was formally adopted, resulting in Denmark emerging as the first recognizable medieval kingdom in the region. Contrastingly, Sweden was the slowest of the Scandinavian regions to centralize. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, power remained divided between competing regional groups, and Christianity only gained a foothold amongst the ruling elites around the turn of the millennium, when Olaf Skärkonung became the first baptized king and issued Christian coinage. Yet both royal and church authority remained limited, and it would take another 150 years before Sweden finally emerged as a unified Christian kingdom. Norway's path to statehood was more violent and far less stable. According to tradition, the Battle of Haverfjord in the late 9th century marked the unification of the country under Harald Fairhair, although the historical reality suggests a far more gradual process. Throughout the 10th century, power remained divided between rival local rulers, and conversion to Christianity was widely opposed. This slow consolidation of royal authority created many areas of resistance within the country, particularly in the western fjords, where local elites were reluctant to pledge their loyalty to a king. Consequently, many chose to leave and seek out a new life for themselves on their own terms, which in turn sparked a new wave of Norse expansion and settlement. Unlike the other areas of Europe which had witnessed Viking expansion, the push westward into the North Atlantic did not involve raiding and conquest, but instead saw immediate settlement, owing largely to most of the lands in the region being uninhabited. The first major destination was Iceland, which Norse sailors had reached and began settling as early as the 870s. Further waves of Vikings arrived with their families in the following decades, with many coming directly from Norway and others from the Norse-controlled regions around the Irish Sea. Iceland offered a way of life without an established political structure, so the settlers built a society governed around a general assembly known as the Althing, effectively an early form of parliament that met annually to set laws and settle disputes. From Iceland, Norse expansion pressed further westwards to Greenland. In the year 985, an Icelandic chieftain named Eric the Red was exiled, and so sailed off to find new lands of his own. Despite Greenland's distance from other Norse lands and harsh living conditions there, Eric was able to gather a group of settlers who subsequently established communities along the southwestern coast. Greenland became the furthest permanent presence in the Norse world, yet attempts to push even further westward followed in the subsequent decades. Around the year 1000, exploratory voyages from Greenland sighted the coast of what is now eastern Canada. Under the leadership of Leif Erikson, the Vikings explored the coasts of what is now eastern Canada before going on to construct a temporary base at the site of what is now Lance or Meadows in Newfoundland. It was here that the Vikings came into contact with Native Americans, whom they called Skraelings and had mixed relations with, sometimes being peaceful but for the most part hostile. As a result, the Vikings determined that the immense distance, limited manpower, and threat of conflict made sustaining the settlement of Newfoundland impractical, so they abandoned it after only a brief period of habitation. Nevertheless, despite the short lifespan of the colony, the fact that the Norse were able to reach North America in the first place stands testament to their maritime capabilities, for the continent would not be seen by European eyes again for almost 500 years. With the advent of the new millennium, the Viking Age had reached its apex, although signs that the power and reach of the Norsemen was fading had already begun to show. Back in the British Isles, the area held under Danelaw had slowly been reconquered by the Anglo-Saxons during the early 10th century, and was promptly absorbed into the newly formed Kingdom of England in the year 927. Although the Vikings tried to re-establish their presence by force at the Battle of Brunanburg a decade later in 937, their defeat to the English king Athelstan meant that their presence in England was thereafter severely reduced. However, areas in the north and east continued to preserve a strong Scandinavian influence, as well as harbor loyalties to the Viking warlords. This resulted in something of a resurgence of Viking activity in England during the latter part of the 10th century, when Danes began raiding the country once again. After a series of political misjudgments by the English king Ethelred in the first decade of the 11th century, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard launched a full-scale invasion and took the throne of England for himself in 1013. His son Canute completed the conquest 3 years later and created a North Sea empire that united England, Denmark, and later Norway under one ruler. The empire nevertheless proved fragile, as after Canute's death in 1335, succession disputes weakened its legitimacy, meaning that by the year 1042, the English throne returned to the Anglo-Saxon dynasty under Edward the Confessor. England, however, despite having secured itself from direct Norse rule, remained deeply connected to Scandinavia, both politically and socially, a factor which would directly lead to one of the most important events in world history taking place in the decades to come.
Beyond the British Isles, Viking expansion also receded as political conditions changed. In the North Atlantic, the Norse settlements in Greenland were slowly abandoned over the next 4 centuries, while Iceland gradually lost its independence and was formally brought under Norwegian rule in 1262. In Eastern Europe, the Kievan Rus developed into a powerful and expansive state between the 10th and 13th centuries, but its Scandinavian founding influences faded as the Slavic language, culture, and political traditions came to dominate. Further south, Varangian warriors continued to serve as elite soldiers in Constantinople, forming an integral part of the Byzantine Empire's military operations, right up until the city's fall to the Ottomans in 1453. In Scandinavia itself, the Viking homelands underwent the most profound transformation. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden emerged as centralized Christian kingdoms, defined by hereditary rule, territorial boundaries, law codes, and integration into the wider feudal world of medieval Europe. As raiding gave way to taxation and warrior bands evolved into royal armies, the distinctive social and religious structures of the Viking Age were replaced by those of stable monarchies. By the end of this process, the Vikings had ceased to exist as a people with a distinct way of life, not because they were defeated or conquered, but because they adapted, absorbed, and assimilated themselves into the culture of others wherever they had gone in the world.